but then I thought maybe you wouldn't understand them. But yeah, I've got this great list of questions here. It's almost like an auditing session, you know.
Wonderful.
They're not boring questions, you know. They're not like how'd you first get into Scientology or something like that, because you've done so many interviews. So these are ones that are sort of unique. So
well, maybe if I could ask you first who you are, and let me say I'm John Atack for anybody that's out there who doesn't know.
Okay, I'm Andy Nolch, and I call myself now half an independent Scientologist. And I've been running the Indie Scientology podcast, and yeah, I was doing the podcast to promote independent Scientology, and now I feel like I don't need to do much more of it. And yeah, so I might do one other interview after you. I think I would like to speak to Marjorie Wakefield, because I think it's interesting how the OT levels affected her. She said that they sent her crazy. I find that fascinating. So I'd like to talk to her, but that's pretty much it. I don't have any more people to talk to or anything, you know, unless I could interview David Miscavige or something like that.
Let's contact him and see.
Yeah, I'm sure he would like to incriminate himself.
Ron Miscavige would probably talk to you, and he's great fun. I know Marjorie. Marjorie's wonderful, and her Road to Xenu, I think, is one of the, you know, and there are now so many autobiographies of former members, starting with Doctor's Report on Dianetics in 1951 and going forward. But I think hers ranks with that and with Helen O'Brien's Dianetics in Limbo, which is the book I would recommend, you know, to find out how Scientology actually got going, you know, because she was the head of the Hubbard Association of Scientologists during the Philadelphia Doctorate Course, and had a very bad falling out with Ron Hubbard. And it's a book that makes you cry. It's just so tragic what happened to her. You know, her partner, John Neugebauer, committed suicide because Hubbard had promised him that he would solve all of his problems, as he so often did. And of course he didn't. And Neugebauer had actually, during World War II, his job was going around on the islands after battles and pushing the corpses into trenches to bury them with a bulldozer. And it upset him a bit. And you know, he never got over it. And Hubbard was like, oh, I can cure that in 10 minutes, you know, or what have you, or a year, or give me some more money, or what have you. So anyway, you're, from the sound of your voice, you're in Australia or somewhere down there, down under, as we say.
Yeah, I'm in Melbourne, where we had the privilege of L. Ron Hubbard visiting us in, I think, 59 to deliver some lectures. And I think that's when he first started talking about OT or something.
The advanced clinical courses back in the day. And just before you get started interrogating me, what is your background? How long you were in Scientology for, and what courses and levels did you do?
Okay, so I was involved with the church for about 6 years in Melbourne, and did a bit at the AO in Sydney.
Did you meet Bernie Lowenstein there?
Yep. How do you know him?
Oh, he was over at St. Hill in 1982, and we roomed in the same place. And he was just an absolutely wonderful guy. I just really liked him. And I was horrified to find that he was still involved, you know, all these years later. He was the CS at Melbourne back then. He said he sat there one day with the auditor magazines going through all of Hubbard's evil purposes and ringing them in red. And then somebody brought in the joking and degrading policy letter, and he had to quickly cover it, you know. But Bernie and Lynn were great, you know.
Yeah, I've heard good stuff about Bernie. I remember people saying stuff like that, like he used to be the CS or something.
Hopefully he'll get declared now that I've mentioned him, you know, and we can talk again. He'll be able to communicate with anyone on any subject if they throw him out.
Well, his family's involved, like his daughter's involved. And when I was involved with the church, he he didn't quite seem active. So I think he was sort of these people that were just hanging around on the fringes. And then, yeah, so I got up to grade 4, and I also read a lot of the basic books. And yeah, as I got along, I just realized that things were just a bit not quite right, just lots of out points. And then I got involved with independent Scientology, and I haven't done too much of that, but I know a lot about it. And yeah, so I'm really keen on interviewing you, to be honest.
No,
so,
I just wanted people to know who you are before I let you, as I say, interrogate me. And
yeah.
that's probably fair enough. So fire away with your list of questions.
Okay, so I've got a little intro here.
Yep.
So let's start. Tonight's guest interview is with Jon Attack. He is a Scientology historian who really knows deep secrets about Scientology and Hubbard personally. He believes that Hubbard was actually an SP, which is a very odd idea to a Scientologist, and it used to be odd to me. He thinks outside the box. He has actually fact-checked Scientology, an action which many Scientologists don't even bother to do. I don't agree with everything he has to say. I consider myself half a Scientologist, but I have here a lot of interesting questions and controversial questions, which I'm sure will be entertaining to hear answered. So, Jon Attack, are you there?
Yeah, let's just correct one thing. My name is Attack.
Oh, sorry. Attack sounds so cool.
It's a commonplace among Scientologists to think otherwise. It means at oak, meaning under the oak tree. It's got nothing to do with attacking people, I promise.
Wow. It's a cool sort of name. It's almost like a cartoon character, you know?
I am almost like a cartoon character, there's no doubt. In fact, my actual surname is Caven Attack, but that just sounds too complicated, so I reduced it to the second bit.
You're like Scientology's enemy.
That's what they think. I think of it totally the other way. I am Scientologist's friend. What I did and everything I did, I had no axe to grind with Scientology. I wasn't upset about my own time in it at all. I had a fine time. Largely because I wasn't on staff, I wasn't humiliated and abused, and I didn't end up bankrupted or any of that kind of stuff, which is so common. But Ken Urquhart, who was L. Ron Hubbard's L. Ron Hubbard communicator for, I think, from 1970 to 1978, he said publicly of me that I was an anti-Scientologist, and I've got to say, no, I'm pro-Scientologist. David Miscavige is anti-Scientologist. I'm here, what I've done was to help people. Not to be opposed to anybody. If David Miscavige wanted to help or L. Ron Hubbard wanted help, I'd have given them help. So that's just to clarify what a true suppressive person is like.
You're waking people up to the truth. You're just doing an enlightenment thing, really, because Scientologists have had so much information kept from them.
Yes.
And it's interesting because when I first came across you when I listened to your 3-part series of interviews with Chris Shelton.
Yeah.
Those 3 long interviews, which are just so fantastic. I really recommend people to listen to them.
Those are the ones about PTSD and about Chris's own experience, because I've done 20 shows now on Shelton's channel. But
yeah, well, whatever. There was one where you did it in 3 parts, and each one was about 2 hours long, and it was sort of covering maybe they were sort of connected, but it was great. It was just like, this is whoa. But my initial impression was, wow, this guy really destroys Scientology. Like you know how you got a good Scientology reg, a good salesman. You're like the opposite of that. You're like the anti-reg. You just destroy it, and it's because you don't sit there doing a sob story. Because people just go, oh well, yeah, you signed up to join the Sea Org, you cause these things yourself, and but you go into the contradictions, you go into Hubbard personally, and you just wreck it, and it's like, whoa. But what you say is, because the Scientologist has had so much information hidden, it's easy for them to dismiss you because they go, no, this guy's just talking crap, he's a liar. You know what I mean? Because it's so shocking, but it's like, no. The truth is really crazy about Hubbard. That's the thing. It's full on crazy. It seems like he was actually insane. What do you think?
Oh, I think his psychiatric condition was very complicated. And I think we can say with some certainty he was paranoid. I think anybody who keeps going on about the whole world trying to get him, the Tenyaka Memorial or the World Bank conspiracy, he was somebody who was frightened of people trying to get him. You know, the CIA are doing this, the FBI. It was none of it true. There's no evidence for these things. So he suffered from paranoia. Interviewing, Barbara Cloden, who was his girlfriend in Los Angeles during the time of his second and bigamous marriage, and the certificates, I'm afraid, prove this. Barbara Cloden was his girlfriend, and she said that he would have days. This is when he was working on Science of Survival, what was really the second book of Dianetics, and he would lock himself in the bedroom for days on end, crying because he was so distressed. So we can say he was depressive.
Do you know what it was about?
He would get angry with himself that he wasn't making any progress, that he didn't have anything else to sell, and that, of course, very rapidly Dianetics collapsed. The first foundation opened in April of 1950. The book was launched, as we all know, on May 9th. It sold 150,000 copies, which was pretty good going. And then the publisher, Art Sepos, at Hermitage House, withdrew it because he said it was fraudulent. He was a medical publisher, and he said, this just isn't true.
And to people who are listening to this who are Scientologists, I mean, that kind of is true. Like, some people get some wins, but the thing is that it is, and this is what woke me up to it, is that because Dianetics gets you into Scientology, but then when you fact check Dianetics, the book, it's just dodgy. It's full of exaggerations, huge exaggerations. And this idea of clear, it's quite possible he full on just invented this cool idea that made people get sucked into it. Yeah. But anyway, I've got a question about the clear, but that's later on.
Okay. Well, yeah, we will come to that. So he basically, his psychiatric condition, he's depressive. He is manic depressive. He has periods of elation where he feels that he's found the solution to the problems of everyone in the universe. And then a few days later, I mean, if you look to the end of his life, there's a guy called Serge Fouth, who was interviewed by Lawrence Wright for Going Clear. And Fouth was with him at the very end, and he was an electronics guy. And Hubbard asked him to build an e-meter that would kill him, and told him, I failed completely, I've got nowhere. Now, that litany, I interviewed people over the years. You know, Jim Dincalci talked about being with him in Queens in 72, 73 in New York, and he'd get depressed. Richard DeMille, he was with him in Cuba in 1952. And just as Barbara Cloden said, he would drink a bottle of Scotch whiskey a day and get very sad and tearful. And then in Cuba, you've got DeMille saying he'd drink a bottle of rum a day and get very tearful. So you've got the public presence of the, you know, I've achieved everything, but in private, he was depressive.
Yeah, he was putting on a fake character. He was actually a really, really good salesman. Really, really good. You're covering all these things that I want to ask you later on.
Oh, damn, I'm sorry.
This is why your Chris Shelton interviews are so cool, because you do this thing where you say something, you go, oh my God, let's go into that. Let's go into that. But I mean, from stories about people on the Apollo, I mean, he was sometimes like hearing noises that weren't there.
Oh, yeah.
You know? Like when they were recording things and people were like, there's no noise there. Or he was he couldn't pick a t-shirt because of the smells of perfumes. And like the messages had to like trick him into getting a t-shirt. And it's just, it's definite signs of like, this guy is like got some mental health problems. Like I understand maybe the depressed thing or something like that, because you can say, I don't know, you can sort of argue that out or something, but actually not being able to pick a t-shirt and then hearing noises, I mean, these things are really wild. And then he invents the OT levels, and the idea of them is talking to entities. And if you go into psych wards and you're around insane people, they have this big thing about hearing voices, and like it's a definite sign of insanity and stuff. And so it's like it's possible he was a highly functional, insane person?
Well, I think we can get very specific, but, you know, I've spent 37 years investigating this man since I left. So, you know, I've talked with psychiatrists, I've talked with people who've evaluated him. In 2015, we did a whole week of a conference with 27 of us talking about Scientology and deconstructing it, the Getting Clear conference in Toronto. And this guy wandered up to me who'd bought a ticket and said, "Hi, I've been using your work for 20 years in my work." And he was a PhD called Yuval Laor. And his work has been on awe and fervor and the way that people become certain about things without having evidence. Does that remind you of anything? And so he presented me with what's called the Bear Fideo Index, which is an assessment of a condition called temporal lobe epilepsy. With temporal lobe epileptics, you don't even necessarily see when they have a fit. Their eyes may move a little, but nothing else. 17 of the 18 traits, I was immediately able to say Hubbard had this. Definitely. So the first one is hypergraphia, which is you can't stop writing. Well, he's in the Guinness Book of Records as the most prolific writer ever. So that one's impossible to argue. He couldn't stop writing. He even talks early on about automatic writing and being driven to write. You also have the sense of, you know, these great cosmic consciousness moments where you feel you know everything. That's part of the condition too. So you have mania, you know, as you go through the traits. And curiously, I did an interview with Yuval about this, which we've never broadcast. And a week later, Chris Shelton did an interview with him, and he didn't really get to explain every point, which is a bit sad because it's very important. However, there was a guy who listened to the podcast or the broadcast, and he was a retired professor. He was a Harvard professor of neurology, right? And he said, he'd never told anybody this, but for 30 years, he'd been collecting material about Ron Hubbard because he found Ron Hubbard completely fascinating. He also said he was at the first lecture that Bear and Fideo gave, I think in 1977, about temporal lobe epilepsy, and he'd not connected Hubbard to this. And he said to Yuval, "You're absolutely right. He's a temporal lobe epileptic." So he was driven, but he was also a sociopath. You know, the destruction. He was also incredibly narcissistic. Look at all the boasting, all of the, you know, I'm the greatest thing in the last 50,000 years. Nobody's had a great idea except for me. It just that's narcissism. It pure.
Yeah. And when you hear the stories about people who work close to him, there's definite signs of acting like an SP and keying in people around him and yelling at them and screaming and scaring them and using fear to control them.
Throwing them off the ship, you know, just because they were 2 minutes late for a course, you know. And
think about, though, if we were going to invent, let's say we created our own religion and we were going to create OT levels or something, we might have some communication courses or some exercises or something, but because we're not insane in hearing voices. But if you're an insane person, right, who hears these voices, of course your idea of OT levels would involve communicating with these voices you're hearing. You see what I mean? Like, I could imagine someone in a psych ward going, "Yeah, let's do this," and blah, 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 like coming up with that idea of the whole body Satan thing. But it wouldn't, from someone who's sane, who doesn't have that, they wouldn't come up with that.
Well, it's interesting. Firstly, in the field of psychiatry, it is accepted that normal people can hear voices. Let's just put that on the table. I don't, and I never have, but I'm told that there is evidence that you can hear voices in your head without being crazy. So, but let me tell you a story. In 1986, I interviewed Virginia Downsborough for the first time in Santa Barbara. And Virginia was an independent Scientologist, I went to her center, she was running courses there. And she said that at the end of 1966, Ron Hubbard sent a desperate call to her to come out to Gran Canaria and rescue him. She arrived. She said he hadn't eaten for days.
Sorry, did you say 86 or 76?
66.
Oh, sorry.
Yep. This is OT3. This is where it's first done. And she said she arrived. He had nobody else with him, and he was out of his mind. He was saying the body thetans were going to get him. He'd not eaten for days. And she said he was surviving on a shelf load of drugs. And she drew her hands apart about, I don't know, 15, 18 inches maybe. This many little bottles of pills he was taking, and that's all he was taking. Now, I later was able to...
Now, what type of drugs? Sorry.
Well,
what type of drugs?
See, I said to her, what were they? And she wouldn't tell me. And the second time I interviewed her, she wouldn't tell me. And
why?
Well, I think probably because she was running the OT3 course in the next room, and she didn't want the whole story to come out. Probably. Later.
And can I say this? This is a big problem with Scientology, is that the reason why Scientologists get sucked into it is because other Scientologists don't tell them what's really going on and out PR things, and that's manipulation. That's wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. And all manipulation is based on deception. The thing that I think the main reason that I stood up when I did, I hadn't really intended it to take quite so long, but so much of my life, but was because I was ashamed that in 9 years of being a public Scientologist, I didn't know that most of the people in the Sea organization were on rice and beans diets permanently, that they were doing the rehabilitation project for us. They were being, and as you say, Hubbard would give them severe reality adjustments, screaming at them. And that had trickled down. So the whole environment, I mean, I left St. Hill the first time I was down there. I left in February 77 because I just got sick and tired of the fascistic military environment. All these people marching around in jackboots and all this. But they did not tell you the way that they were suffering. And, that's just wrong. I mean,
they were enabling Hubbard.
Yes. And it's typical of any situation. When Kennedy decided, on the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba, sending 1,400 people to defeat an army of 200,000, nobody around him dared say, this is a really stupid idea, Mr. President, because people get into groupthink. They fall in with it. When people in the Catholic and Anglican and Methodist and Baptist and all these churches that have concealed child sexual abuse. In Australia, there you had 8,000 cases of abuse by 500 Catholic priests. And it was covered up because, we don't want people to think badly about our organization. So I think there's a natural tendency. The problem is, as soon as you find that out, it's time to leave. It's time to, if you wish to be self-determined, then it's time to leave, and which is what you did, and think about it from the outside.
Yeah. So about the drugs. So did you end up finding out what he was on? Yeah.
He admits. I mean, if you look to Dianetics, and the lectures in 1950, he says if you have to grab hold of anything, grab hold of Benzedrine. So the first drug is amphetamine, and he's recommending it, and it's still in the book. Even the edited edition still has Benzedrine in it. According to the testimony of his son Nibs, much of which I believe, not all, I was in touch with Nibs before his death. The way that History of Man was written was that he turned up, aged 18, wanting to see his dad, who'd abandoned him 10 years before. And, any kid, and his dad says, here, take some of these and lie on the couch and tell me what you're doing. And then in 2 weeks, Mary Sue Hubbard, L. Ron Hubbard, and L. Ron Hubbard Jr. took a huge amount of amphetamines, and out of that came a cold-blooded and factual account of your last 60 trillion years. Now, you think about how long it would take to write a history of 60 trillion years. This is bullshit, but that's amphetamines.
Is amphetamines like ecstasy or something? Or
no, speed. It's speed.
Speed.
Yeah.
Speed, yeah. So it's not like, but to have a whole shelf load full of them, do you think it was just a lot of the same drug or just a whole variety?
No, he also had a problem with phenobarbital. I wrote a paper called Never Believe a Hypnotist, which is a quote from Science of Survival. And of course, he admitted to having been a hypnotist from the age of 16. So I'm afraid he was saying we shouldn't believe him. In that paper, there are various references, and one of them is to a lecture where he says that he was addicted to phenobarbital, which is also called Nembutal. It's a barbiturate and a very dangerous drug. And he says, I made myself a guinea pig in one of these experiments. Well, his medical records from World War II, Veterans Administration, show that he was given phenobarbital for a year then. And curiously, this was being used alongside a therapy very like Dianetics to get people through terrible traumatic incidents, particularly pilots in North Africa who'd been in burning planes, were given a huge amount of phenobarbital and then, put through something like Dianetics to abreact, to relive the trauma they'd experienced. Hubbard, when he talks about looking at the medical library at Oak Knoll, putting a white coat on and sneaking in, he would have been reading what Grinker and Spiegel, the two psychiatrists who developed this technique, and he was taking the drug at that time. In 1965, so years on, he tries to cash a prescription in East Grinstead for Nembutal, phenobarbital, signed Dr. L. Ron Hubbard. So 15 years later, he's still trying to get this drug. We know that he took a drug called Demerol, which is an opioid drug. And what his son Nibs said, which I think is true, was that, and it is, one of the early titles for Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, my book about Scientology, was Hubbard Through the Looking Glass, because he is the opposite of what he claims to be. He is not anywhere
He was playing a character. He was just playing a character out of his stories.
Yes.
The world savior.
And the character is the opposite. As his son says, he was an Aleister Crowley fanatic and he believed himself to be the Beast 666. There's a bulletin that was extracted from OT8. When OT8 was released, for the first week, it had a bulletin on it where Hubbard admits that he is Lucifer, that he is.
Yeah, and it seems like that is legitimate. That's not some made up thing. It actually makes sense when you fact check it. It passes. Is that what you found?
Jesse Prince has approved it. He was the head of tech at the time, and he says yes, this is right. There was a guy, I can't remember his name, something White. He actually did it in that first week, and he gave the same account. And curiously, there's this wacko book called Lonesome Squirrel by Steve Fishman, who, as far as I know, is a con man. Yeah. But Fishman described it before OT8 was released. We don't know how he got his hands on it, but it's the same story.
But he would have written that after OT8 was released, wouldn't he?
OT8 was released in 1988, and I think Lonesome Squirrel slightly predates it.
Not from when I looked into it. I thought he wrote all that stuff. I thought he was still involved. I think he had all these problems in the church in about 89 or something, and then
could be.
I think it was after, because somehow he left. He wanted to do the bridge, and he got data from the free zoners, and then he I don't know, he just went wild. That was his fascinating. If you listen to his 3-hour interview.
I haven't. I read Lonesome Squirrel and decided that what he was saying couldn't possibly be true. So I was quite surprised later to see that OT8 did seem to, but he didn't see OT8 as part of Scientology. He claimed he'd seen it, that Hubbard had shown it to him, that he'd gone out and visited, in Creston.
It's probably best to avoid, because we know he's just full of it. So it's hard with him. But in the interview it is quite interesting listening to him when he still is a believer, and just hearing someone so thoroughly brainwashed. He full on bought into it. So we were talking about the drug stuff. Alan Walter said he was on drugs, and Alan Walter, how do you think Alan Walter knew that?
Well, Alan was part of the close circle around Hubbard, along with Neville Chamberlain, who was one of his close friends. Bill Franks would have known Alan, so he was close enough. What's interesting is that say that Janice Grady Gillam, who says she was with him every day for 11 years from the age of 11, that she never saw him take drugs, but kind of going, well, Neville Chamberlain told me he'd seen him injecting something. He didn't know what. He certainly took a huge amount of painkillers after he hurt his shoulder in the motorbike accident, which an OT certainly wouldn't have had a motorbike accident. And he did a lot of screaming and wanted a lot of painkillers. he had prescription pads signed. We believe Eugene Denk, his doctor at the end, signed pads for him. Don't know, allegation, don't want to be sued. But there was a doctor during the Apollo years who also signed pads for him, so he could go and get whatever he wanted. I was going to say is that Nibs said that what his father liked to do was to take contraindicated drugs. So you'd take an upper and a downer at the same time and see what happened.
Oh, that really sends you crazy.
And that was what he was after. So it seems that the research, what he calls research, was him taking drugs and, writing down what happened. And he makes admissions about research, so that, for example, on the LSD years after they've come off of LSD, he says on research into 2 cases. Now, just to put that in context, a medical study, a gold standard study, has 1,000 people in the study, and it must be replicated by a second study of 1,000 people. 2 cases is not enough. The INT rundown, which I talked about with both Mike Rinder and who was guarding Bruce Welsh, who's the only research case. And I talked with Karen de la Carriere, who said that not only did the introspection rundown, which of course killed Lisa McPherson and probably others, the L11 came out of that research too. That just one person that you're going to call that research, that's just crazy.
Yeah, that's what's interesting when you hear the stories of people close to him, and you work out how he came to his discoveries, and you're like, oh, this is a bit. So let's look at the OT3 story. It does absolutely sound like something that would have come out of a crazy drug dream. So that it makes absolute sense. And then you look at Hubbard's behavior throughout his life, the erraticness, the craziness. It does come across as someone who was on drugs.
Yeah, he's an alcoholic who was also a multiple drug abuser. I had a bizarre experience. In 1984, after I'd stopped believing, not very long after, a friend of mine who had done OT2 came to me, and he didn't know whether he ought to buy a Ducati motorbike or do OT3 in the independents, because they cost the same, about £500. And rather than saying, if I were you, I'd buy the motorbike, which would be my advice to anyone who's has that choice, get the motorbike. I said, look, here's an OT3 pack. Make your own mind up. There was no risk. He'd done OT2. He was in the non-interference area. He came to see me on Saturday.
You were rescuing him from the non-interference area.
Yeah.
He might crash his motorbike if he went and bought it.
Exactly. So we needed him to get rid of his body thetans so they didn't, interfere with his motorbiking.
It's not a sales tactic or anything, this non-interference zone, no.
No. So, curiously, he brought the pack back just after I'd come back from the first meeting I had with Jerry Armstrong in July 1984, it would have been. And Jerry had come over to testify in the Leahy case, child custody case, which became quite a celebrated a cause célèbre that it made the front pages of 3 newspapers here. And Jerry had just told me that Hubbard was on drugs when he did OT3. It was the first time anybody had suggested this to me. And I said to my friend, Jerry had said he was on drugs when he did this. And he'd handed me the pack back and he said, I'm going to buy the motorbike. But he said, oh, phenobarbital. And I did a double take and I went, I just said drugs. Jerry told me phenobarbital. Why do you think phenobarbital? And he said, oh, well, as a young man, I left school to join the Merchant Navy and travel the world and taste every drug I could, which young people used to do back in the old days, apparently. And he said, if you take phenobarbital, you get the sense that you're being exploded into multiple separate beings. And so he said OT3 is just Hubbard's record of his own phenobarbital trip.
Whoa, that's interesting that it has that effect. And then, I mean, when we look into these things, they make sense. Sense. So what about when Nibs said that Hubbard was importing drugs? That was a pretty outrageous statement.
Yeah, that one's difficult. He said that his father had him flying a small plane bringing cocaine in. And you see, with Nibs, it was difficult because he himself admitted he was a chip off the old block. And, you need to be careful. But what I found, and have you seen The Telling of Me by Me, his last book?
No. He wrote a book.
He wrote 2 books, 1/10 of 10% of Scientology, which Paulette Cooper edited for him. And they bought that from him. In the end, they bought him off, I think, with several $100,000.
Wow.
And in return, he signed a statement saying that everything he said was perjury and none of it true. But unbeknownst to them, he made this other manuscript. And a member of the family, 6 years ago, a member of the family contacted me and said, would I like to see this manuscript? And I'd have to, basically say that I wouldn't show it to anybody. And I didn't, and I haven't, but it was a fascinating piece of work. That manuscript is now available. It's become available in the last couple of months in the UCLA library in University of California in Los Angeles, which has this huge collection, about 100 bankers' boxes of Scientology material. And I'm told that it is in there now, it is public, and I'm going to ask that somebody publish it because it's fascinating. And this is what I came to. If Nibs is talking about something he experienced, he'll tell you the truth. If Nibs is telling you about something his father told him, he believes it. And, one of the stories is that his father was given the magic by the same person that gave it to Hitler. Now, Nibs wasn't there. And so this story, we must take with a pinch of salt.
It sounds like a Hubbard exaggeration that sounds entertaining. So
yeah. And I mean, there is a bizarre edge to it, which is we know that both Himmler and Rudolf Hess, so the founder of the SS, the head of the SS and the Gestapo, and the deputy leader of the Nazi Party were both members of the Thule Society, the Thule Group, which is, of course, where the OTO, which Hubbard was associated with, came from. It was a German group.
Yeah. It's connected. So, when you chase it up, it's connected. Yeah.
Yeah, but I didn't find anything in Hubbard that I couldn't trace straight to Crowley. Most of Scientology comes from Crowley. Most of the ideas, like the birth engram or OTTR0, all sorts of things just come creative processing. They come directly from Crowley.
But hold on, didn't Nibs create OTTR0, or was I wrong?
He's the upper index in Nibs, TR5 to.
Okay. Sorry, I've just got so many questions. So, with the importing drugs thing,
you might have to, this might not be your last. You might have to come and interview me 10 times before you can finish.
I know. So, the Apollo ship was being accused of being a drug dealing ship, and you could say that that's made up stuff. But what do you think about what Nibs said about this importing thing?
Well, let's talk about the drug trafficking. There is one case of it, a man called Baron Berez. If you look to Auditor 41, I didn't believe these stories about Hubbard throwing people overboard. I only heard them after I left. As we say, they keep quiet about it. And then
he was filming them and laughing. I mean, what's the deal with the filming? I mean,
exactly.
Whoa.
Photo credits, Auditor 41, L. Ron Hubbard. And there's a guy being thrown overboard. And the guy in the Sea Org uniform with a big smile on his face who's throwing him overboard, that's Baron Berez. And Berez was later arrested for drug dealing. And it was one of the ships that was off the California coast, I believe, which was being used as a training ship. And he was going down to Mexico, picking stuff up on the boat and bringing it back in. So that one I've heard,
Okay, and we know Hubbard's idea about ethics in that it's for the greater good. So if he could get a bunch of cash together for importing some drugs or something like that, it wouldn't surprise me,
It makes sense, doesn't it? If the only person who will ever be capable of discovering technology is Ron Hubbard, then anything that makes him feel good is therefore for the greater good of everything, because he is again, as Nibs said, he's a God maker. And it only peeps out once in the Philadelphia Doctorate Course. Hubbard makes this statement about games. Life is a game. Everything's a game. And in a game, you have pieces. And the rule is that the players mustn't let the pieces know what the rules are. Then,
yeah, exactly, yeah.
Above the players, there is the game maker, and he doesn't have to follow the rules.
Exactly, and that's why he contradicts himself all the time with all these things, continually. Like he says one thing, then does the other, because it's not for him. Scientology is for the masses to follow him, you know. So Kimmer Douglas said that Hubbard was impotent from, and I assume that she knew this because of he probably cracked onto her or something.
Well, she was his nurse, so and I think Kimmer's relationship with Hubbard is unique. Ellen Jones, who was a senior CS in LA and married to the relatively famous Mark Jones, who commanded a wing of the Air Force in Korea before becoming devoted to Hubbard. But Ellen she asked me years and years ago, 30 years ago, 35 years ago, she said, did I know anybody that had actually left Hubbard without being thrown out? That because she'd started thinking about it and going, Kimmer Douglas is the only person who looked at him one day and said, I can't do this anymore. You know, the other people were, you know, like Captain Bill or David Mayo or whoever, they're thrown out. He pushes them away.
How was Captain Bill thrown out of Hubbard?
Oh, in 1982, Hubbard had him declared suppressive.
Oh, you reckon Hubbard did that?
Oh, I'm sure. Hubbard was running everything till 83.
So Captain Bill just claimed that was like David Miscavige or something.
Yeah, Miscavige had no power whatsoever in 1982. He only followed orders directly from Hubbard.
And that's how he got so successful as well, because he just did what Hubbard said. He was like the biggest enabler you could ever imagine. And Hubbard went more crazy and paranoid and was putting people on the running program, like torturing them.
Oh yeah, I mean, breaking people.
But then the free zoners tend to stick with the idea that no, that was like the government or Miscavige or someone like that, and they just, it's like, no, when you think about it, he had a dictatorship going.
Well, the Germans say a fish stinks from the head down. If there's something wrong in an organization, look at the head of the organization first. Don't make excuses. And with Hubbard, you know, I got this thing, an independent came to me and he was giving a talk about, you know, why the independents were better than the mother cult. And he said, when did the harassment begin? And I said, well, the first example I have is the theft of the mailing list from the Wichita Foundation in 1952 by James Elliott. And James Elliott is listed on Hubbard's letterhead at that time as his business manager. And he was caught stealing. And the reason we know the mailing list was stolen is that Hubbard wrote 31 letters to everybody on that list, right? And we have those letters. So that was the first. And he said, this guy came back to me and said, no, after David Mayo left, when did the harassment start? And you're going, I see. The point is, the law can be used very easily to harass. That's 1955. You know, Hubbard was always attacking, you know.
Hey, and look at when he cancelled the fair game thing. Oh, he didn't cancel it. If you read it carefully, this is when I realized
we don't use the words anymore.
Exactly. Hubbard is so Scientologists don't realize this. They read it at superficial face value and they go, oh yeah, it's been cancelled. And it's like, no, listen what he's freaking well saying. Actually read the words. Do what the supervisors recommend. Literal, read it. He's saying declaring. No, he says basically, fair game is causing PR problems.
The words fair game may not appear on any order.
Exactly. He's basically saying we're still going to use it. We're just not going to publicly say it. It's going secretive is basically what he's saying.
Let me, this is a very rare thing. This is the basic staff hat book as used in Scientology. And what's rare about it is this. It's got a stick-in page. And underneath that page, it's got the actual original fair game law, showing that it was published. It was part of the training. And as you say, the words were taken away, but I can absolutely testify that the practice of fair game continued. I was harassed almost daily for 16 years.
It didn't. Yeah, and I could tell by reading that, but this is the thing with Scientology is people don't interpret what Hubbard's saying right. If you think it from the point of view that he's very intelligent, he's very shifty, then you read it and you go, oh, I get it. Yeah, he's just saying, hey, wink, wink, we're cancelling fair game, but we're not really cancelling it. And so he's very, I don't know, it's just people don't pick up on that element that you got to be, you're dealing with like a potential black magician whenever you're reading any of his stuff, and you got to think real deep into it.
But I mean, for me, the most interesting period on that point is February, March 66. He issues 4 policy letters, all of which are called attacks on Scientology. And one of them is broad public issue. And it says, advocate total freedom. For attack, we advocate total freedom. Each distribution on the other 3 policy letters, and they're written over 2 days, is more and more limited. The one that went to the Guardian's office is about finding out as much information as you can on somebody and ruining them. Then a few days later, he writes What is Greatness and talks about avoiding the temptation to hate anybody. And he's just founded the Guardian's office. He's just created an intelligence agency. Not for the first time. The Guardian's office is actually supersedes earlier attempts at harassing opponents. Now it will become systematic and enormous. When you look at what the Guardian's office did, I mean, Lawrence Wright mistakenly says they had 5,000 staff. They didn't, but they had infiltrated the Canadian, British, French, US
Australian
governments to steal material so that they could blackmail people, so that Hubbard could do what the hell he liked.
And it's pretty silly because it just causes more problems, and you're just opening up a can of worms by engaging in such behavior.
But they got away with it for a long time. And look at this thing that's happened in Germany, where the Germans said, look, according to the Simon Bolivar, the responsibilities of leaders policy, any Scientologist has their first loyalty to Scientology. So they can't be in the civil service. They can't work for the government because, you know, it's like there was a police lieutenant who was going into FBI computers to stop them catching people there. So you can't. They have a loyalty to Scientology and they cannot be trusted. How is it that every president from Clinton onwards in the US has said that this is a religious discrimination of some kind, where all they're doing is protecting themselves from an intelligence agency? But one president after another, right through Obama, has actually every year said Germany is violating the policies with regard to the sanctity of religion. Why is that? How do they have that much power? Well, it could be because Clinton was at Oxford with Richard Rees, who was the TechSec UK back in the day. And he said, you know, I was at Oxford with one of these people, it can't be that bad. It could be because George, the Bush family, are friends with Willie B. Wilson, the oil billionaire who was a Scientologist. And you keep on going that this influence, which should not exist in a free democratic society, Scientology did get away with it. And the reality is that although he had 300 writs out for him, Hubbard died without having to go to court ever, without being charged with any crime, even though, you know, there was so much.
No, but he was charged with something in France, and he was supposed to go to jail for it.
Yeah, that's true. He was charged in France, and he was sentenced in absentia. But as long as he didn't go to France, he was safe. You're quite right. I stand correct.
Yeah, he was.
In the US, he's listed as an unindicted co-conspirator, along with 37 others, including Kendrick Moxon, the head of Scientology's legal, possibly to this day. But Mary Sue, of course, signed her almost 300-page confession so that he wouldn't be charged. So he was guilty, but he managed to eke out his days, collect $648 million, while staff in the Sea Organization, the elite Sea Organization, were not allowed to have toilet paper.
Yeah, it's real. It's just like, he is just classic. The way how the money just from the org just scoots away and goes up to upper management. With his shiftiness, it seems like he uses a tactic that which other people use, where you say something, but you're doing the exact opposite because it helps cover it up. So let's say you're burning down lots of trees. You say, no, we have to save the trees and stuff, because then people don't think that you might have done that because you care about trees. So he does this. He knows these things. And also he's got this book called Fear. Have you read that one?
Yes. Stephen King said it was his favorite story.
Well, in that is mentioned, isn't it mentioned stuff how something about the Catholic Church using demons to control people or something like that. And you read it and you go, oh, this is very interesting. Hubbard was aware that you can, with demons and entities or whatever, you can use it as a control system to control people.
One of the songs, those dreadful songs on Road to Freedom, he talks about priestly begons and talks about them selling you the idea of demons, and you're going, well, there you go.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and he criticizes. This is so funny. He criticizes people for doing stuff that he was exactly doing.
The criminal accuses others of things he himself is doing. L. Ron Hubbard. I used to keep that on. The criminal accuses others of things he himself is doing. There was a copy of the Auditor which had his photo, doing that with that underneath. I used to have it on my wall.
And it worked. It worked when I was involved with the church, and that it worked because you I don't know, you just think this guy doesn't like the criminal or whatever. You know what I mean? And so it actually makes you think that he was good. So what about so Kimmel was saying that he was impotent from drug use.
Penicillin and all sorts of things that he was fixing.
Was it from steroid use, or what was the impotency from?
I don't really know, but I think she was probably correct that from the mid-60s, he couldn't get it up.
Yeah, and someone said, what was Janice Gilham Grady? She said that Hubbard wasn't sleeping with Mary Sue for years.
Yeah.
So that makes sense, doesn't it?
And as a clear, of course, you'd have thought he would be able to get an erection, but there you go.
You mentioned that cool thing about Captain Bill being declared. Do you know anything real specific of how that came about?
It's what led up to it. That do you know about the Sea Org marching band in Clearwater? That Bill had got these people. Bless him. He was. I knew Bill very well. For 8 months, he lived in East Grinstead, and he kept coming around to see me and going, "Please get back into Scientology." And I'm kind of, no way. But we had long conversations, and I really liked the guy, but he had a lot of bad things going on. So basically, he'd got them into a little bit of trouble in Clearwater because they'd marched through the town singing these crazy Captain Bill songs, which are even worse than Hubbard's songs, frankly.
Really?
We all live only to die in our ships up in the sky. Really not very good. And then he was assigned to the Commodore's Messenger Organization along with Norman Starkey. And they were put in charge of getting rid of the Guardian's office, of taking all the power away, because Hubbard came to believe that the Guardian's office were conspiring with the mission holders to take Scientology over. And he was right. Alan Walter, who you mentioned before, had put together a program called The Game. And in 81, he approached Bill Franks, who was then the executive director international, didn't have any power, but he had a big title, and various other of the old league of Sea Org members to take Scientology over because they believed Hubbard had gone. Because of Hubbard going into hiding, you no longer got anything from him other than advices. And you couldn't tell who'd written them or where they'd come from. And so a whole group of former and current at the time high-ranking Sea Org members did join in a conspiracy to use the Guardian's office after the 1981 Mission Holders Conference and take things over because they saw that the messengers, they believed that the messengers were not taking instructions from Hubbard. They thought that they'd gone rogue under the heading of probably the leadership of D.D. Vogading. Because, of course, Miscavige was just the head of the Action Bureau then. He had no power at all within the hierarchy. And D.D. was completely, Diane Vogading, I think she was completely loyal to Hubbard and a wonderful person, if I may say so. I mean, there's some fantastic people. really empathetic, lovely people, intelligent people who got to the head of top of Scientology and were then weaponized by Hubbard to destroy the lives of those below them. So this conspiracy was real. It was going on. And Norman Starkey, old-timer, was put in charge of legal and stopped. They were just about to settle with Mike Flynn. The Guardian's office had got a deal for $2 million against this lawyer who had 25 cases, who was setting up the Clearwater hearings, who was really the death knell of Scientology. You know, I carried it on, but Flynn's the guy that really dug in and made it impossible for Scientology to survive. And they'd got it all settled. And Starkey walked into the room and said, "There will be blood." And that was the end of that deal. They ended up paying him $5 million instead of $2 million. And the damage had been done because the Armstrong case had gone public in '84. So Captain Bill is there to get rid of the Guardian's office. But Captain Bill, as far as I work out from talking with him, and I could be wrong, he really liked Mary Sue Hubbard. And he refused to accept that Ron was going to get rid of her. Now, to get some idea of it, Ron Hubbard was the Commodore. Mary Sue Hubbard was the first Deputy Commodore. Captain Bill was the second Deputy Commodore. So he was the third in charge of Scientology. That was the rank he held. He, he's a captain in the Sea Org, all of this stuff. And he wouldn't take Mary Sue Hubbard out. With the famous story is that Miscavige threw an ashtray at her. He'd done his TR8 and knew what to do with ashtrays and make them float across the room. And she conceded and backed down and gave over the controllership of the Guardian's office, which led to the CMO taking over the Guardian's office and actually just taking branch one, the harassment division, taking the top off it, Mo Budlong, and keeping it running and renaming it the Office of Special Affairs, with people like Miles Mellor and Peter Stumkey, who just carried on doing what they'd been doing in the Guardian's office. So Bill fell between, I don't think he knew he was doing it, but he went against Hubbard's orders. So that was the end for him.
Okay. I mean, I think that's the case, because Hubbard seemed to have done backflips on people he was close with, who were helping him for years. Yeah, I mean, it has a whole history of it, so it's possible he did
nobody
a backflip
survived.
on, Captain Billy, and yeah, exactly. There's no like person who was like friends with him that was like, yeah, I was friends with Hubbard and that, and like, is there any? There's no personal testimony if anyone's like, yeah, I was best friends with Hubbard from 1940 onwards. It's like, I mean, he only had some people that were fanatically following him, and he only had people he was ordering around.
I mean, the last person who could claim to be a friend would be Reg Sharp at St. Hill in the early 60s. And there are lots of lectures where Hubbard says, Reg and me went boating, Reg and me did this, that, and the other. And then he fell out with him. Reg Sharp published several Scientology books, and he was still living on St. Hill Green, right next to the place, which is 4 miles out of the town, when I left. And when asked, he said, it's like, why have you stayed here? You should leave. And Reg just said, I'm waiting for them to leave, which he's now popped his clogs and they're still there. But he lived, literally across the road from one of the entrances, a narrow little lane, 1 car width from the entrance to the back entrance to St. Hill. But he's the only person at any point who appears to have been a friend that he had, as you say, subordinates and lackeys, and people like David Mayo, who for 25 years dedicated his life to Ron, and then Hubbard turns around and says he was the bird dog in the control room. And you're going, so for 25 years, this great Master OT didn't notice that David Mayo was a suppressive person. That's kind of weird. And the same is true for one after another. John Campbell Jr., Joe Winter, Don Rogers, who was on the boards of the first 4 years. Every organization, Don was on the board. Hubbard Dianetic Research Foundation, Hubbard Dianetic Foundation, the Scientology things. And he's the only one I met who he did walk away from Hubbard. He basically said his case had been cracked. Dianetics used to have an appendix by Don H. Rogers, right into the 1980s. It was always at the end of the book, called The Mind Schematic. And Don basically decided that black and white processing, 8.80 or 88,000, I think it's 8.80, you probably know, it's a long time since I looked at these things. It cracked his case and he was absolutely fine. So when I contacted him 30 years later, he wasn't somebody who'd fallen out with Hubbard, but he had a great deal to say that was very interesting about what had actually happened, you know, and how the tech was actually developed.
Wow. And we've got Otto Roos, who that you just kicked out. And I mean, I bought into the idea that the government or Miscavige corrupted things and stuff like that. But when you really look into it and you fact check it, you investigate it, you find out that, nah, he probably did declare David Mayo, you know, like.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and you go, yeah, he probably did order Miscavige to do these things by his advices and stuff like that. I'm sure Miscavige changed some statistics and stuff like that and did some dodgy things. But it seems like as Hubbard got more and more, as he got older and he got crazier, he's had his dictatorship going on, and they were executing more crazy stuff. And I imagine the good people blew because they were like, I'm not going to do this. And more bad people came in like Miscavige, and they just did what he wanted because Miscavige wanted power as well. And then Miscavige just took over from what Hubbard was doing. You know,
I think the transition is fairly straightforward, that the order that appointed Pat Broker, the first loyal officer, and basically gave Scientology to him was true. That came from Hubbard.
Do you think that's true?
Yeah.
I thought that sounds like that Pat Broker wrote it, because it doesn't even sound like Hubbard's wording.
Well, see, Hubbard by this time would be saying, "Here, you say it, you write it."
That's a good point. Things were so crazy back then, and that's also maybe when there's the idea that he did the fake Ron's Journal thingos and stuff. But he was so outpointing at that stage that it's possible that that's why they didn't want his voice out there or something, because he was like a psych case, basically. He was type 3 towards the end.
Well, of course, at autopsy, they did find the psychiatric drug Vistaril in his body, and they found points where it had been injected. It's worth saying that the last will, the declaration that he wanted to be rapidly cremated, those were notarized by David Miscavige, but David Miscavige was never in the room with him. So they're fakes. So the actual will is the 1981 will that left everything to his granddaughter Roanne, the daughter of Diana, who, in case anybody in Scientology is worried, I don't think she's going to be going after them for that. But
this is the one he tried to make sure she stayed in Scientology when her parents had a divorce?
Yeah, Jesse Prince at Toronto, one of the talks he gave, he was sent out to persuade to Florida to persuade Diana to sign Roanne over. She was 7, I think, at the time, to the guardianship within. And she, from there for the next 27 years, she was at the base at Gilman Hot Springs. So Hubbard had always had, there's a policy letter about Quentin being, you know, he will take over from him in the early 60s. He's saying, you know, he wants it to be a kind of, you know, King Ron I, King Ron II. He wants to set up a dynasty. But of course, there is now, of his own family, there's only Diana left. Everybody else is gone.
Yeah, the kids didn't even want to be in the Sea Organ stuff and do Scientology, because also he didn't seem to give them much perks or anything. He seemed to treat them like crap. He
had very little to do with them, and I think Diana is very tragic because she actually is a very talented pianist. I've seen her play, and she was just completely subsumed into serving her father.
Did you hear that Nib said that he had an orgy with LRH?
Oh, he had lots of them. He said that what his father liked to do was take one of the groupies, and she would be given a mixture of drugs that would render her amnesiac. So if you mix barbiturates, you know, and Nibs gives a very precise description. He says what his father liked to do is to tie the woman up naked and cut her with a razor blade. That was his idea of getting his jollies. May or may not be true. No other witnesses to that one. But they'd wake up and they wouldn't know what had happened to them.
Man, I mean, but he was into Crowley, so Crowley was doing wild sexual things, so we don't. I mean,
yeah, and in 1949, Hubbard writes a letter to Forry Ackerman, his agent, who gave us all of his letters. Tony Ortega's put this letter up, where he writes boasting that he's found something that's got so many selling angles, and you can rape a woman, and the next day she'll know nothing about it. He doesn't say anything about Dianetics being good for you. And what's more, the technique that becomes Dianetics wasn't tried on anyone before the book was written. Don Rogers told me he was using deep trance hypnosis. And when Art Sepos, through John Campbell, commissioned the book, he turned to Don and he said, well, deep trance hypnosis is unpopular. I'm going to use the light trance version, which is called Reverie, of course, by hypnotists, and has been for many years. So even there, and they claim to have 272 cases that he's cleared, there wasn't anyone. Nobody has ever come forward of those 272 people. It's a complete invention. Complete invention.
Yeah. Did LH do LSD?
He told David Mayo in a conversation that he had, David told me, and I had a letter from a guy who was a member of a New Age group in California who said his guru had taken LSD with Hubbard, yeah.
Because it's interesting, because LSD, you have like cognitions and stuff like that. It seems like it would be in competition with Scientology. Like if I took,
you don't think that's why he banned it for use among Scientologists, do you? That they might suddenly see things from a different perspective.
Exactly, and he never talks about other practices. He barely ever mentions them. It's like they don't exist in his universe because he doesn't want people to realize that, hey, there's other tech out there, you know?
Yeah, it's he's not in, I a long time ago came to a diagnosis which I'm not qualified to give, which is that Hubbard was a solipsist, which is the worst kind of narcissist. They think that everyone else is just a part of their imagination. And I was very gratified in the book where 37 mental health experts took Donald Trump apart. The great Robert J. Lifton says, no, he's not a narcissist, he's a solipsist. And I went, yes, that these people, we're cartoons. That Hubbard had an absolute contempt for the rest of humanity. He didn't have any affection for his own children. When he heard that Quentin was dead, he said, basically, this is another fine mess you've got me into. He was just concerned about the the bad propaganda, the bad public relations it would cause. Mary Sue Hubbard, at least, she fell over in trauma and howled.
Yeah, she was like crying. And what's his face? Captain Bill spreads the whole idea that it was a conspiracy in that. But then it's like, no, we know 2 times before that Quentin tried to kill himself. He's gay, and gay people have a long history of trying to kill themselves. They've got high rates of it. He wanted to be a pilot. He was being controlled in the Sea Org. It just, to me, it just indicates, yeah, he did kill himself.
Yeah. And
sometimes the things that Captain Bill say it's just annoying because you're just like, whoa.
Well, Captain Bill said that the Markabians were going to take over by 1986. He said
and did he say that Hubbard was dead even though we know he was alive at that stage?
Yeah, he was up on the mothership, and I don't know if you've seen there's a video on my site about Captain Bill, and one of my close friends, during the 8 months she was in East Grinstead, he lived in her house, and they in public presented as a couple. And then one day and she was a friend of mine, lovely woman. And one day...
Hold on a second. Are you suggesting that they were in a pretend relationship?
Well, I'll tell you what she told me.
Well, were they kissing and stuff, or did it seem like a...
No.
So did it just seem like 2 friends? It didn't
the pretense was that they were a couple, that he wanted it to be seen that way. But did he actually say that? Well, they'd go around together arm in arm. She was his girlfriend. He lived in her house, her little bungalow.
But
everybody just presumed that they were a couple.
But did he? But are you saying that you know for sure that he was pretending to have her as a girlfriend? Like, was he doing a PR stunt? Is what I'm trying to find out.
He was. For 8 months, it was just commonly believed that she was his girlfriend. What she told me, and she was desolate. She was really upset because she thought she was his girlfriend too. But she said, we never had sex. She said on a Saturday, we would go up to London. We would go into an outsized women's clothing store. And for anybody that doesn't know who Captain Bill is, he was 6'4". He was a Mississippi motorcycle cop during the freedom rides in the early 60s, which probably has some dodgy stories around it. But he was a big guy, a big hairy guy. And she said he would point out which clothes he wanted. She would buy them. And then at 8 o'clock, almost every evening, he would dress up in a ball gown and he would sing songs to the mirror to L. Ron Elray, which he says is the name, he gives as the name for Hubbard. Now, the thing that confirms this, when you look to the sector operations bulletins or SOBs, they are signed by Astor Parmegian. And there's one, I've got it in his handwriting, where he says Astor Parmegian, and then underneath, in parentheses, Captain B.A. Robertson, right? In his own handwriting. Now, Astor Parmegian is a nightclub singer in the Revolt in the Stars, the movie script about OT3 that Hubbard wrote, and that John Travolta is still trying to get produced somewhere after the failure of Battlefield Earth. So he was saying that he was Astor Parmegian. 75 million years ago, he was Ron Hubbard's girlfriend.
And he was a transsexual.
He was a cross-dresser, yeah.
So it's possible he was bisexual or gay or something.
Transvestites most often are not gay, I'm told. They dress up as women. But he did say to me one day that he had twice witnessed Hubbard doing something that if anybody knew about it, they would leave Scientology immediately. And he would not tell me what.
Oh, I know. I've heard you say that. And I'm just like, I wish I knew what that was. But I mean, what makes, because Hubbard's done a lot of outrageous things. What makes you think it's gay? Because actually the gay thing is...
I didn't say probably... that, you did.
Yeah, okay. Well, yeah, because I was going to say, I mean, I wouldn't even think gay. I would think it would be something more outrageous, like him saying to Nibs that he wanted to steal a nuclear weapon. I think that's totally possible from Hubbard because he wanted to take over the world. What do you think it might be then?
Andre Teboyan told a story about walking in on Hubbard raping a 12-year-old boy in Morocco. And I mean,
that's so outrageous. I mean, how is anyone going to believe that? How can you convince the people listening to this that that's true? I mean, like, do you just think he wouldn't? Who's Andre? Andre
Teboyan was a senior executive in this organization at the time. When you become too incredible, you become invisible. L. Ron Hubbard.
Did Hubbard say that?
Yeah, when you become
exactly,
you become invisible.
That's what he's probably using. Yeah. So Andre, because I've heard about Andre before. So what was he in the Apollo or something, or what?
He was on board the ship, and he claimed that when he left, which would have been I think the late 80s, he signed several affidavits and then disappeared. And in one of them, and I'm afraid I couldn't tell you where anymore. It's a long time since I went into my Scientology archive. In one of them, he said he had walked in on Hubbard having a sexual moment with a 12-year-old boy.
Where at?
In a room somewhere ashore in Morocco.
In Morocco or something.
Yeah. The other story...
and sorry, can I say something? In this Mission Earth book, his Mission Earth fiction book, he mentions lots of things that actually occurred in his life. For example, there's the character gets married when he's married to someone else, and they go around the Mediterranean and stuff. But there's a story in there of a character who is like a transvestite or something, and he's with little boys in that.
Yeah, and you've got ring of boys fused together with their bums pointing out, and he talks about degraded novels. You know, I mean, oh.
I actually found it so funny, but yeah. So I mean, that's a really wild thing. But I guess it makes sense if he was involved with Crowley's stuff, because Crowley was into that sort of stuff, wasn't he?
Yeah, and this is the point, and this is the significant point, that if you are to be a serious magician, and Crowley did this himself, you have to break the laws of morality. You have to, whatever those laws are. Crowley had a thing when he was a young man that he would walk around with a razor blade in his pocket, and if he didn't do the bad thing, he had to cut himself. So he was using aversion therapy so that he would. It's like when Dustin Hoffman was, because he's a motivational, type of actor, a method actor. When he was doing Hook, which is a wonderful film, he walked around with garlic in his mouth, raw garlic, and got really close to people to see what their response would be, so that he could become Hook in the movie. So it's kind of like that whatever the rules of morality are, all the drugs, all the alcohol, torturing women. I mean, Sarah, the bigamous second wife, you remember in Shrinking World of L. Ron Hubbard, where Charlie Nairn asks him about his wives, he says, "I had no second wife." Yeah, he had Polly and Mary Sue. In between was a void. Well, when Sarah divorced him, she said she was deaf in one ear because he'd hit her so hard one night it had ruptured the eustachian tube. His first wife talked about being tortured. Nibs about seeing his mother being tortured.
See, people wouldn't believe this, but then you hear about the stories about the Apollo ship, and I think there was some messenger that Hubbard cracked onto, and she rejected him. And I don't know, maybe he didn't hit her, but he screamed really violently. He has these violent outbursts, but there were some people that he hit and stuff. So I don't know. It's just like, wow, he really is. L. Ron Hubbard in Scientology is literally a character. It's just an invented character. Yeah.
And I mean, the same is true of many celebrities and many public figures. But in his case, you have to, overboarding, you start with that. When I first asked Nev Chamberlain about overboarding, he went, "Oh, yeah, that happened." Then a couple of weeks later, we were having dinner, and I just got him at the right moment. And I said, "What was it like?" And he said, "It was terrifying. It was terrifying. You were being thrown from higher than the height board at a swimming pool, right? You're being thrown off a ship into the sea, not into a swimming pool. If you can't swim, your ankles are tied together so you can be hauled back up. This is
crazy. But also they had a blindfold on some people, and they had their hands tied. I mean, that's pretty wild. Because when I first heard about it, I thought, oh yeah, you harden someone up because you're given this challenging experience. Because I've jumped from high heights before. But then when you look at it from the prospect of the hands tied and the thing, and some of them are like middle-aged women, and then like he's filming it and they're laughing, and it's like, whoa.
Yeah, Dianetics was going to relieve your trauma. Being in the Sea Org was going to traumatize you. But the one story aboard the ship that there are enough witnesses to it, there was a very annoying child, 4.5, 5 years old. And so Hubbard decided that he had to be dealt with, and he was put into the chain locker. Now, the chain locker is where the chain would be kept when you were not moored. It's about 4 feet high. It's full of bilge water, which stinks. It's completely pitch black, and there are rats in there. And you're putting a 4-year-old child in there. I don't think you have to go any further with the story of Ron Hubbard. This man was a sadist. Liberating humanity. Come on,
No, but then when he died or whatever, before he died or something, I think according to Jesse Prince or something, Hubbard didn't ask about Mary Sue or something. He didn't even, like, before he was leaving, leave a message for Mary Sue.
Oh, it's much worse than that. She went to prison to save him. She wrote letters to him complaining about what Miscavige had done, trying to set things right. Hubbard gave an order that her messages to him she didn't want to have any N theta, sorry, in the American pronunciation. And so a messenger would go through the letters they'd be photocopied, and go through it with a razor blade to take out anything that might upset him. So the letters usually read, "Dear Ron, love Mary Sue." And he refused to see her. She'd gone to prison to save his ass. And he refused to see her, wouldn't have anything to do with her. And in the will, I think she's left $1 million, which was out of 648. And Scientology exists as much because of her as it does of him. You know, she was the controller. She was
a major enabler and a major action thing. But Miss Cabbage gets blamed for some of these things. But it's like, no. Hubbard's messengers, he sent the messages out so they copped the abuse, and then he just got the message from them. So it's like they get blamed for things that Hubbard was causing.
Yes.
You know?
Yeah. The criminal accuses others of things he himself is doing. And let's face it, if this guy was an OT, he knew they were doing these things. If he was an OT, he didn't need the Guardian's office. He could look in the records himself. He wasn't. He was a complete fake.
That's actually a very good point. If they worked out this psychic ability, then they could just have a team of psychics in a room sitting down. Oh no, but I think that they were going into the government buildings and trying to change the documents, physically put a new document in, or erase them from the records. Largely,
they were just stealing them. The idea was that they wanted to win the IRS case, and they wanted to know everything that was going to be coming their way. So they made an application that brought all of the documents into one place, so that Meissner and Gerald Wolfe could go in and they could get all of the documents that would be used in court cases against Scientology. Those documents were enough to fill a room floor to ceiling. They stole an enormous amount of documents. I spoke to the guy in GeoLegal, who I'd better not name, and the guy in GeoPR who went through the documents. And the PR guy, this was great. I was in Sunland in LA in 86. And I'd just given a talk, public talk, and everybody had gone. It was my first public talk in the US. And I'm sat in the jacuzzi, looking out over the valley and all the lights. It's absolutely brilliant. And this guy arrives. Everybody's gone. He says, "My name's Joe Leonard. That's not my real name. I'm a private detective, but I used to be in the Guardian's office PR, and I'm going to tell you what I saw. There's nobody else here. This doesn't go on record." It's one of those kind of moments. So he climbs into the jacuzzi and tells me the story. He says, the FBI had no idea what they'd got in the documents because they couldn't read Scientologese. They didn't know what was being said. You know, when it said R245, they didn't realize that was an order to murder somebody. And he said, so one of the things that nobody knows about is that there was another branch. There's branch 1, covert data collection, branch 2, overt data collection, and branch 4. Never found out what branch 3 was. But branch 4 was the armed squad. And he said they had documents which, if they'd understood what was being said, showed that they'd gone to the gay clubs around through California, showed a picture of Quentin, put the owner of the club up against the wall with a gun in his mouth, and said, "If you let this kid in, we'll kill you."
Whoa, Hubbard really didn't want his son being gay.
And the funny thing is, when we were in Toronto, Jerry Armstrong started talking about Johnny Goodbugger. And it's like, what are you saying, Jerry? And he said, oh, sorry, that's what Omar Garrison and I used to call Hubbard, Johnny Goodbugger, because we had letters from his teens which showed how much he liked gay sex. So go figure with that one.
Gosh. I mean,
through the looking glass, it's the opposite of what you were told.
Yes, exactly. So many things are the opposite. It's just like, whoa, because he seemed to not like gays, but then he engages in it. He's engaged in it himself, and it's just like, what the hell?
I was told, I haven't seen the document myself because my own interest in the history declined somewhat, But I'm told that Robert Heinlein, in his private diaries, because he was a friend of Hubbard's, close friend, that he recorded not only that Hubbard had had sex with his wife, but he had sex with him. So, you know, his predilections may not have been quite as advertised.
I think a lot of the black PR was the fact that just the truth about his existence was coming out, basically. And it wasn't made up things.
Yeah.
You know?
And
how can you...
Go ahead.
I was going to say, how can you convince me he was an alcoholic? Because I think
it's in the medical records at the end of his life. If the people who were attending him, Serge Fouth, Jesse Prince knew about this, that he actually was rushed to hospital at one point because he had pancreatitis caused by acute alcoholism.
And on that place in, was it Creston or something, they were all having alcohol. They were all drinking there a lot, and workers...
Creston, yeah, he and Pat Broker were just getting completely whacked every night.
In the last year of his life, his staff would go out there and they would end up becoming alcoholics, and the whole vibe of it was just about alcohol or something. And it's just because I think that if we can prove that that's true and we can believe that, then it opens up the door to all the other things actually possibly being true.
Well, you see, I'd go the other way on, and I have done many times, that L. Ron Hubbard said honesty is sanity. So let's start with that premise. If he was dishonest, by his own definition, he was insane. If he was insane, we shouldn't be doing what he suggested. That's a pretty simple formula. Okay, yeah. Dishonest. In 1965, in My Philosophy, which is a handwritten Hubbard document that used to be on display at St. Hill. I don't know if it still is because they won't let me in anymore. And I wouldn't want to go there, frankly. It's not a real castle at all. It's a pretend castle. Handwritten document, we find that he was basically injured he had physical injuries to hip and back. I'm not sure what other kind there is, but he chose to put the word physical in. And he was blinded. At the end of World War II, he faced an almost non-existent future, abandoned by friends and family. I sat crying abandoned by his friends and family. So at the end of World War II, he is crippled, he is blinded. That's 1965. Well, I'm back to 1957. There's a professional auditor's bulletin called Communication and Isness, in which he talks about on July the 25th, 1945, the end of the war is the 14th of August, I was in Hollywood, crippled and blinded. And I was attacked by 3 petty officers. And I remembered my judo. This is the only place I've ever seen him talk about judo, but I remembered my judo. And I ended up smashing a bottle on one of them. And I beat 3 petty officers. Now, I've had it put to me that this was because of, his necessity level came up. And he was able to beat up 3 sailors, 3, even though he was crippled and blinded. But I'd like to point out that he says in 1965 that he had injured optic nerves. And there's no amount of necessity level that's going to make your eyes work if you have injured optic nerves. But also, this is only 3 weeks, less than 3 weeks before the end of World War II. Well, he's meant to be in this hospital for a year, crippled and blinded. So there's a little bit of now let's go back to December 19.
And that's just one example. There's
let me give you the third
shit talker. He's a major shit talker.
Let me give you the third one because people watching or listening may need to have a little bit more. In December 1950, Ron Hubbard gave an interview with Look magazine. And in it, he talked about his war wounds, right? They are pink eye, conjunctivitis, itchy, irritable eyes, ulcers, both of which are confirmed by his medical records, by the way, a fall down a ship's ladder, and something wrong with my feet. That's the list of Ron Hubbard's war wounds in 1950. By 57, he's beating up petty officers. By 65, he's been crippled and blinded. I went through 22 autobiographical accounts that Hubbard gave. No 2 tell the same story. Honesty is sanity. He was a liar. He
was so dodgy, and he was making all this money from his religion, yet he was still getting his pension from the Navy. For
$38 a month till he
I mean, but that's really, that indicates his attitude towards it, in that it's like, get as much money as you can, even if it's $38, it's worth it. It's like whoa, that's really wild.
And when you look at the list of claims in Dianetics, the cures, it cures asthma. He had asthma to his dying day. It cures short-sightedness. He wore spectacles all his life. It cures bursitis. I'd never heard of it. In his right shoulder. These things are, in fact, in his medical records. But he had them all his life. Dianetics didn't cure anything.
Exactly. And he was, yeah, and it also didn't just make him more rational and sensible, or other Scientologists make him more rational or sensible or not aberrated, because the whole key of it was not to be aberrated. But it's based on, it's his version of psychology. It's his version of Freudian therapy and stuff that he went wild with, and it doesn't handle the correct whys. It's like the wrong target and stuff, and he benefits from these wrong targets. You know what I mean? Because he gets the money. It's really epic. But what about you've spoken to John McMaster, the world's first clear, and what was fascinating about when you told that was that I thought that he would have done session after session and then had a session where it was like, whoa, I got no reactive mind, I suddenly feel amazing. That's what I thought it would be like. But apparently he was just going to session. Then Hubbard was like, oh, you're clear now. And it's like, well, did he have any moment of suddenly being like, I don't have a reaction or anything? Like,
no. And
exactly.
I interviewed John. I did 2 3-hour interviews with him, and I met him at other points as well. And he was the great hero for those people who'd seen him during the 5 years that he was the world's first real clear. He wasn't the world's first clear. Hubbard, of course, had claimed 272 of them in Dianetics.
And can I say something, that he was well-spoken, well-liked. He was a perfect PR person. And it seems like he was just classically chosen by, yeah, we're going to make this guy the world's first clear.
I had a phone call in about 1995 from a set designer in Hollywood. And the guy said to me that he was one of the first 10 clears. And that, you know, he'd left Scientology long since, but it always struck him as rather odd that 7 of the first 10 clears were gay, including himself and John McMaster. And he didn't understand that. And I couldn't understand why he needed it to be explained to him that Hubbard had got the material on them if he needed. I've just found out they were gay, you know.
Yeah, he was probably auditing them, and he probably thought, oh, this guy seems like he'll be good for PR. And also, he's gay, and we've got the blackmail. Fantastic. So he's going to go along with, and it's just like, whoa, because it seems like Clear is just totally made up. Like, it's just made up.
Yeah, it is. And the Dianetic technique, if you know, it's very important. The thing that, you know, this is not my main occupation. In 1996, I walked away from, you know, the Scientology thing, because I frankly got tired of being harassed and nobody helping to protect me. Arnie Lerma, the late and rather strange Arnie Lerma, but bless him, when I asked him to write a puff for the new Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, he said, before the internet and safety in numbers, there was John Atack. And it's probably true. And I got tired of it. So I moved away from it. And then I just was irresistibly drawn back because I realized that people don't get over it. Now, this has been for me, this is a fascinating conversation because you are so incredibly knowledgeable. Yeah. You've thought about this so much. You've poked around and fitted this together. And you've basically, just as I did, thought yourself into it and then thought yourself out of it, or half out of it. You told me at the beginning of the conversation. I'm thinking you might be 3/4 out of it by the time we're done here, you know, but, you know, but that you've seen some of the contradictions. Well, here's something that shocked me after I left. Knowing that Hubbard had said, you know, he'd said this comes from Freud before he decided he'd done it all himself. I went looking through Freud and I found a series of lectures given in Worcester, Massachusetts before the First World War, where Freud describes the Dianetic technique. He has charge, he has going earlier similar, he has counting the person into the state. And at the end of it, he explains why he abandoned it. He says, because it's the opposite of therapy. It makes people more dependent on the therapist rather than more independent.
That's probably why Hubbard picked it.
Well,
it's true. They get addicted to it. They're auditing junkies.
Well, exactly, auditing junkie. I'm glad that's an expression I invented in the 1980s. So I'm glad.
Right, it's a good expression.
The high point of my career. You get this astonishing thing. Hubbard says he learned about Freud from Commander Thompson. Now, Scientology were unable to prove any connection between Thompson and Hubbard. When I was working with Russell Miller on Barefaced Messiah, Russell got the passenger list from a ship that had gone through the Panama Canal. Hubbard said he was 12 years old when he met him, and he was. They're both on this ship. They're there for a few days. And that's led some strange people in the independents to think that there must have been something sexual in their relationship. Some people are just obsessed. I don't know why they go in this direction. There's nothing to indicate that. There's nothing in Thompson's record that indicates that. What is fascinating to me is that in 1923, if Thompson, we know he did talk to Hubbard, and if he did talk about Freud, the material that was available in English in 1923 was fairly limited. And among it are the Worcester, Massachusetts lectures. So it's eminently possible that Hubbard was in fact told about this technique, which was actually Josef Breuer's technique that was used on Anna Fourneau, which is another whole story. Freud was a fraud. That's another, he's as bad as Hubbard, and he had a lot more influence and caused terrible damage. But even he is saying, don't use this technique because it makes people more dependent. It's anti-therapy. And that's the idea, which is not to detract from anything that anybody gained in Scientology. If somebody had an experience, a beneficial experience, then they own that. That's theirs. But I would say that getting people to feel euphoric, to have very good indicators, is a fundamental aspect of hypnotherapy. And that because you feel high doesn't mean that you've actually had a life-changing experience. Scientologists get high, they have a win, but they do not become capable of communicating with anyone on any subject, as it says on grade 0, low grade, because they're forbidden to talk about their case.
No, but even if they weren't forbidden to talk about these things, they wouldn't be able to communicate with anyone anyway.
No.
You know what I mean? Maybe grade 0 helps them to do it a bit, but it's just so overblown and exaggerated. But what about the clear cognition being you're mocking it all up? That's so interesting, the way he chooses those things. It's like the black magic thing. It's like, yeah, wake up, you idiot. You're sitting there in a chair just mocking all this stuff up.
Yeah, and curiously, it's the last thing that the pilot says at the end of the 36 days in OT3. You're mocking it up.
Exactly. I actually had that. I was going to talk about that because it's another little hint for people who are switched on to realize, hey, it's like Hubbard saying, hey, I'm not screwing you over. I'm a fiction author. I mean, I contradict myself all the time. Can't you work it out? I put in I said he as well. He's mocking it all up. The pilot says he's mocking it all up. I'm a he. You see what I mean? And then you have the clear cognition, and it's like he's it's just fascinating because people don't realize that they're in some mind control matrix or something.
Well, what about when he says in the PDC, all of you lived lives in arse lickers?
Yeah, exactly. That could be it. It could be the same thing.
It's a joke. He's just come back from England where he's heard the expression, instead of arse lickers. People who are toadies, people who do as they're told, brown nosers, call them what you will. All of you, that's what you are. And you're giving me $500 and you sit there for 6 weeks and I say, you've got a doctorate for listening to me for 6 weeks. Oh, come on, Yeah.
And Nibs said that he would mention how people are so dumb and you can take advantage of them and laugh or something like that?
Nib's, I've had the great pleasure of meeting one of Nib's children. I better not mention which one because Scientology is a bit vindictive. And he said that his father had told him that his grandfather would say, I wonder if we can get them to see if you can get them, tell you what, see if you can get them to do a thing with an ashtray where they pick it up. And while they're picking it up, they say, sit down. See if you can get them to shout at an ashtray. See if you can get them to do it. And that a lot of processes were just developed to see, you know, if people, how far you could push people. You know, the upshot of Scientology, and I've said this again and again and again, Charlie Nairn, when he was 25 years old, when he interviewed Hubbard for The Shrinking World of L. Ron Hubbard, which anybody who's in Scientology ought to watch, because it's the only hostile interview. It's only 20 minutes long. It's on YouTube. And in it, Hubbard is all over the place. His eyes are blinking, you know, the great master of PR. He had no second wife. There are no Swiss. There is one Swiss bank account. When he's asked about reincarnation, whether he believes in it, he pauses. And then Charlie says, but your followers believe. And he goes, oh, yes, they believe in it. Sure. Charlie said that his great regret was that the 2-hour conversation that led up to this, and they started taping at 4 a.m, he'd said to Hubbard, it's a scam, isn't it? And Hubbard said, yeah, of course. Just like that. And so Charlie, who's a brilliant guy, absolutely brilliant guy, he said to him, that must be so hard for you, having to pretend all the time. And Ron said, yes, it's really hard for me. It's hard. So he said, why do you do it? And he said, it's really great being able to tell your wife at the end of every day, you've just made $10,000. And this is 1968, when $10,000 was really worth something, you know, hundreds of thousands now, every day. But the main reason is I like to catch the clever ones and reel them in. And you suddenly realize you're dealing with a 10-year-old boy. None of the girls will look at him because he's spotty and fat. And he hates the other kids and he's going to get his own back on them. And that's his whole life. He lived in misery. He was physically ill all the time.
The only thing is that about that thing is that if Hubbard thought that the journalists were these stupid shifty 1-1s, then he would sit down and go, all right, I'm going to be shifty and I'm going to say exactly, I'm gonna lie to this guy and say, yeah, I want to suck people in, you know what I mean? You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, let me tell you something about phenobarbital. Phenobarbital, there are some early lectures. There's a 23rd September 1950 lecture called Introduction to Dianetics, where Hubbard tells the truth about his background. He says, I failed a course in atomic and molecular physics, not I am a nuclear physicist, which is not the same thing as atomic physics at all, but which wasn't being taught when he was young. I failed the course. Now, here's the thing about phenobarbital. It's very close to sodium pentothal, the truth drug. And there's, when you take this drug, and I've never taken phenobarbital, so I have no personal experience, but I'm told that when you take it, it was used as an interrogation drug. So I think there are days when Hubbard was so loaded on this stuff that he was actually truthful. And narcissists have this thing. I have a friend who is a forensic psychologist, and I've met other people who do it. And it's always amazing when you hear how they interview some white-collar criminal who has done, you know, embezzled $10 million or something. And the way to get them to talk is to congratulate them, to tell them how clever they are, how cunning they are, and they'll suddenly start pouring out an admission, a confession. I think that's what happened, that Hubbard simply told Charlie the truth.
You got him in a good mood.
Yeah.
By and then Hubbard just just opened up.
Spilled the beans.
Yeah, I mean, if that's, I don't know, but the only thing I have a problem with that is that I know that Hubbard's shifty and that he thinks that journalists are 1-1s and that he would then try and say something to him to appease him or something like that.
But when you look at the interview itself, you'd think that he'd have given a rather more clever interview and that he's sitting there blinking and, you know.
Well, it's because he's so tired. You know what I mean? Because it was like he stayed up all night, but that's strange behavior again. It's like, why don't they have normal sleep patterns and stuff? Everything about it is so crazy. Like well, look at the running program is just freaking wild. And now they're charging people for it, calling it cause resurgence. And it's like, it's some sort of, it is freaking crazy. Like, come on. Imagine you, anyway.
Yeah, as to the sleep, this is not late for Hubbard. Hubbard normally went to sleep after 4 a.m. and slept till noon. Miscavige is the same. Mao Zedong was the same.
But there's
and before we get too personal about it, so am I. I have delayed sleep-wake phase. It's a genetic condition, and I'm assessed, diagnosed with it. So, you know, it doesn't mean you're a bad person, you know, but Mao Zedong, David Miscavige and Hubbard all had delayed sleep-wake. So this wasn't...
The staff didn't get to sleep in. The staff had to wake up in the morning when they had to do late nights. They had to wake up, didn't they?
Yeah.
They were sleep deprived. I mean, it's crazy. It's like some sort of government mind control experiment on torture or something.
Yeah, I mean, one of the questions because Jim Dinkelsey was with Hubbard in Queens, it's after that in 72, 73, it's after that the RPF, the Rehabilitation Project Force, comes out. And one of the questions I keep putting to Jim, I keep emailing him every few years and saying, when he was in Queens, did he read Lifton? Because it seems to me that the RPF is based on, where's the lovely book gone? I always keep it nearby in case I'm going to need it.
So the RPF came out after he came back from New York.
Yeah. And it, you know, and everybody ought to read this book. This is the master text for me. And Lifton's written many other brilliant things, but Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism. And you then assess Scientology against this and you go, oh my God, you know, this is such a way of getting somebody into a state where they don't know what's going on. You know, when I interviewed Mike Rinder just a few weeks ago now, I've talked to over 1,000 people who've been involved in Scientology. And some of them I've interviewed in tremendous depth over the years. But Mike still really shocked me when he talked about the conditions on the ship. You know, he's sent in from Australia. He's 18 years old. He was 6 when his parents got in. They've paid for him to come over, and he's going to do the Flag Executive Briefing Course. He's going to do the greatest management system ever devised in this.
Even though the mission holders had more successful running missions and stuff that made more money, they had better management running.
Much more. But you know, these are early days. This is before mission holders are making that much money as well. This is 73, and he's going to do this course, which I guess Jay Hurwitz would have been supervising. It's the original FEBC, and this is the greatest management technology in the world. The Sea Organization are the elite of humanity, according to Hubbard. Hubbard is on the ship, so Hubbard's running it. And yet, he goes into the men's dorm, the former hold of the cattle ferry, the Apollo, and he's saying the stench was unbearable. And when I interviewed Karen de la Carrière a week later, she said, it was, you didn't want to walk past. And you've got 60 men with these bunks that are so close together that you can't sleep on your side. You can sleep on your front or your back. You have to climb out. You've got no closets for your clothes. You've got no lights. You've got no ventilation. And you're going, this is the greatest man who ever lived running the greatest management system.
I know. And Hubbard had this perfectly clean office where they had to even went through it and they dusted each page of a book, which is disgusting behavior. I mean, as if anyone would go along with that. I would say, Hubbard, we've got to clear the planet. How dare you make me dust the pages of a book? Yeah. Anyway, it's just crazy. But if you give people conflicting statements, which confuses them. So you confuse a person, you don't give them, I guess, good food, you don't give them enough sleep, and then you scare them by having the punishments, they go into, I guess, this crazy zone of just being able to be pushed around like a pinball. And that's probably what he wanted. Yeah,
zombification. And it was tremendously... I remember talking to a friend who worked directly and closely with Hubbard, and he said that the one thing he always wanted was to be posted somewhere away from Hubbard, because around Hubbard it was always awful. The suppressive is surrounded by ill and cowering associates. DeMille who of course was with Hubbard. He wrote 3 of the Hubbard books were actually written by DeMille. It compiled from Hubbard's ideas. DeMille wasn't claiming they were his ideas, but Science of Survival, which is the book that got me in, is so much better written than Dianetics. It's a really coherent text, whereas Dianetics just rambles and says the same things over and over again about how many abortions all women have, because let's face it, you can't trust women, can you, if you're a misogynist?
And can I say something as well? He promotes that book, Big League Sales, and in that book, the guy says, oh yeah, you can sell women anything, you can take advantage of them and just sell them heaps. And I like it. And it gives you an idea of the attitude of what Hubbard wanted with his regs, which was just to sell them everything, just bleed them.
Yeah, well,
and work out any way to get all the money you can from them.
Yeah, I mean, I pulled that, the hard selling stuff fascinated me because...
Yeah, he created that. Hubbard created that. It wasn't some bad staff members. The hard sell came from Hubbard.
Yeah, well, let's read a couple of quotations into the record. The governing policy of Scientology, as stated by its creator, is, and it's called Governing Policy, the policy letter, make money, make more money, and make other people produce so as to make more money. So that's the governing policy of the religion. Scientology sales staff are trained extensively in hard selling techniques. We go on, blah, blah, blah. Hubbard said this of his Scientology courses: advanced courses are the most valuable service on the planet. Life insurance, houses, cars, stocks, bonds, college savings are all transitory and impermanent. Advanced courses last forever and give immortality. They give you immortality.
Can I say something as well? I mean, it's just like you actually look into the benefits people get from the higher levels, and there's more evidence indicating that it actually causes more problems.
Mm.
You know, it's actually like, it's just wild.
Yeah, well, I mean, let's return to that point in a minute, because you're absolutely right, things to be said. There's nothing to compare with advanced courses. They're infinitely valuable and transcend time itself. So that's Hubbard. In a dispatch called What is Life Worth? The Importance of Hard Sell, Hubbard said, and capital letters, hard sell is a must, capital letters, in dissemination and selling of services and materials. In another dispatch, he says of hard selling, you tell him that he is going to sign up right now and he is going to take it right now. One does not describe something, one commands something. You will find that a lot of people are in a more or less hypnotic daze. And you're not taught anything about hypnosis in Scientology.
And this is the way he treats his fellow Scientologists.
They're raw meat, dead in the head wogs, or... Yeah,
and his staff and everything, he treats them like as in they're just pinballs to be pushed around and stuff.
Yeah, to finish that statement, you'll find a lot of people are in a more or less hypnotic daze and they respond to direct commands in literature and ads. Hard sell means insistence that people buy. Hubbard made his notions clear in this passage. Never, capital letters, let anyone simply walk out, and never let a student leave or quit. Introvert him like a bullet. Further, you have to be willing to invade privacy, very definitely. Recruits don't have any rights, right? Don't have any rights. In internal issues, Hubbard derided non-Scientologists as wogs, which is a very rude word where I live. It's the N word where I live. Raw meat, dead in the head. And his absolute contempt for everybody when we are talking about a religious system that's meant to make us compassionate and decent, and that's actually just turning people into narcissists.
Absolutely. They go into his personality because they read so much stuff of him. They end up picking up on it and they become these egomaniacs.
Yeah. And it's all about making money. It's all about bossing people around. You know, when I interviewed Otto Rose, who was the first OT8, he did OT8 in, I think, 71. And he said to me, you know, the problem with Scientology, and he still believed in it all, is it erodes people's compassion. Now, I would aver that for humanity to survive, there are two things that are going to be a necessity. The first is compassion, that we care about each other. And the second is humility. And these are two things that are found nowhere. In fact, compassion is you have no sympathy. that's as close as Hubbard ever gets to any kind of compassion, any kind of fellow feeling. He's an arrogant narcissist. And if you do the system, of course, you'll turn into a clone of him, which I've seen happen once or twice over the years.
All right. Well, we should wrap this up.
Yep.
But how about I ask you about this is an interesting question. I really hope you can answer it. Did you hear about the GO putting on stage plays of the OT3 story in order to key in some people? I think maybe in LA or something. There were local SPs or something. What I find really interesting about that is, did the people get keyed in? Did they have accidents the next day? Did they die from anything? Because that's a big way to test if it actually is real.
Well, Hubbard, of course, wrote Revolt in the Stars with the idea of making a movie of the OT3 incident, having said that anybody who is restimulated will die within 2 days. So I think that kind of, there's the little circle that he's telling you one thing and then he's going, yeah, let's kill everyone in the world. And
I mean, you
could die laughing. You could die laughing.
Is that the conflicting statements idea? Like, it's just confusing as hell. And I think people are just, when they're in Scientology from the start to when they get out, it's just they're in this whole ball of confusion all the way through.
Yeah,
days of confusion.
Yeah, it's called double bind. That you, and Hubbard does talk about it in false data stripping material, that if you give people conflicting information, they don't know what to do and they'll come and to be told what to do. He's in the Philadelphia Doctorate Course, he says, we have ways here of making slaves. And that's what Scientology is. And of course, your kind of Brave New World model, as opposed to 1984, which is the Sea Org, Brave New World, you're basically, everybody's happy because they believe in the delusion. But when you come down to it, everybody in the Sea organization is in fear. That's the highest tone level of the Sea organization. Will my stats go up? Will I be punished? Will I be RPF'd? Will I get enough to eat? Will I be allowed to have children? Will I be allowed to have children?
And when you look at the people who've done the higher levels, it comes down to them wasting a lot of time and money, and then also possibly having some mental problems as well.
Oh, quite severely. I was asked to give a talk at Haywards Heath Mental Hospital, which is where people from East Grinstead would go to, and they'd had a guy who'd done OT3 who was having a pretty hard time of it. He basically had smeared the walls of his cell with his own excrement and would hit anybody that came into the room. And I suppose, if you don't, until you have the experience, sometimes you don't think about it. When my first child was born, I was still, I wasn't involved in this. I was still thinking, we've all got to be very quiet, because, and it's like, oh, well, it's still in my head. I'm still thinking that he could get, this will be an engram, he'll this, that, and the other. So until you challenge it. So my thought was, look, this is a psychiatric hospital. They're not going to really care about this. I'm going to go along and there's going to be one person there because these people run long shifts. There were 14 members of staff, doctors and nurses, because they were so concerned that every 6 months they got somebody who was batshit crazy coming out of Scientology. And they sat and listened to the whole talk. They thanked me for the advice I gave them, which was don't give them any drugs at all, because it will just freak them out more. And it's an acute psychosis. It will settle down, given a few weeks. The person may well, however, suffer it for the rest of their life. They may well come back to it. Let me say something about the OT levels, which I think is very significant. For many years, I went out and lectured. I put a little piece of tinfoil on the table and I say, any OTs who are remotely perceiving me at the moment, or any in the audience, I just want you to move this tinfoil 1 inch during the course of the lecture. That's all, to demonstrate OT abilities. Tinfoil, it's not heavy. It never happened. James Randi offered $1 million for decades to anybody who could prove a psychic feat. No Scientologist ever claimed it. I've been around Scientology now since 1974. I have never seen a psychic feat. Never. Nothing I couldn't explain easily. I've never seen anybody levitate. Remote viewing, we've had Derren Brown here show how you can do that. That's not difficult. It's not difficult if you're Derren Brown. A show called Messiah where he did it. It's baloney. And even the people that are claimed to have done it, like Ingo Swann, who is a really weird character, but we did cross swords eventually. But Ingo said he could do it before he came to Scientology.
Exactly. That's the thing. People have these abilities beforehand, because I believe in this sort of stuff. But it's like, anyway, but with the
$1 million for 20 years and nobody claimed it and you believe in it? Why do you believe in it?
No, I don't trust Randy. I think he's getting money from some sort of pharmaceutical company to promote things. And I mean, it's a whole nother story.
Yeah, let's have that other story. What evidence do you have that Randy had money from pharmaceutical companies?
I don't know, but I looked into him and he was shifty. I didn't like him when I looked into his history and stuff like that. And I was like,
what was it you didn't like about him?
I don't know. I think there's some documentary on him or something. And
there are several documentaries about him, but
no, but the thing is, I heard that if you actually go to him with an actual psychic ability that you can prove, he then says, "Oh, sorry, we're not going to accept you," and so that's how he's protected his $1 million.
No, I don't. I think that is. It's probably like the one that psychics do, like they say, "Well, I can't do it because there are disbelievers in the room." Randy was not the only person. There were various people you could go to the Skeptics Society, and there's never been anything like it. If you look back to the Rhine Institute in the 30s, Susan Blackmore's investigation of the paranormal when she was chair of parapsychology at Bristol University, and her book Out of the Body, people who've tried to deeply investigate these things come up against the same things every time, that there's nobody proving these things. Derren Brown, of course, is able to do table turning and writing on slates in a closed thing, and he can show you how it's done. So
it's just that I've come across people who have got like the remote viewing ability, and they actually get paid by the police to find like missing children and stuff.
No, we checked into that in the UK, and a friend of mine wrote to every police. There are 41 different police forces, and asked about that because it had been claimed, and they said we've never had a case where that was true.
Yeah. Well, anyway, it's a different story, but I don't think
you have to do another show.
Yeah, well, I think that there's strong evidence that Scientology doesn't give the ability to these psychic abilities. But they like to pretend like they some of these OTs like to pretend like they can do it, and then when you ask them to test it out, they have some convenient excuse like, "Oh, I didn't sleep well last night," or something like that.
And they don't want to freak you out.
Or because didn't Hubbard say something like you shouldn't demonstrate your OT abilities because you'll become a target or something like that? And it's like if Hubbard could demonstrate it, he would have ran around and had that person going around so that he could have these huge recruit events and stuff and huge promotion events, big time. But about the OT3 thing and people going insane, what's difficult about that is it makes you think, oh, maybe OT3 is true. You know what I mean? If people are actually going insane on it.
Well, believing that they're possessed by demons and that they have no control over themselves anymore. I don't think if you take somebody, I mean, Hubbard himself, along the way, as I say, when Virginia Downsborough went there, he said that they've taken me over. And at the end of his life, he was telling people like Serge Fouth that the body thetans have won.
It's crazy because, and also you listen to Alan Walter and he says stuff like, oh, he was running, and then like when he's running, training or whatever, he gets ideas coming to his head and it's entities, and it's just like, come on, you've been running a lot. Like you just get an idea come into your head to say like, oh, I have a break or something like that, and you're just saying it's a ghost or an entity. Like it's just so wishy-washy. It's like, what the hell?
I mean, in terms of the OT levels, there's a story that really bears telling. The Clearwater hearings, I think Mark Bunker has put them all up on the videos now. In May 1982, a man called Brown McKee testified. I believe he'd been involved with Scientology for 24 years. He was a physicist, and he made me laugh because he said that while he knew that what Hubbard was saying about physics was absolute baloney, he was really interested in the Buddhism. Now, I was a Buddhist and I came to Scientology, and I knew that what Hubbard was saying about Buddhism was absolute baloney, all this Maitreya stuff. It's nonsense. It's invented. There is nothing in the Pali literature that says, you're in 2,500 years, a red-headed man will come in the East who will be Maitreya. And the proof that he wasn't Maitreya or Maitreya is, of course, humanity ends with Maitreya. Everybody goes into nirvana and there is no human race. So Ron Hubbard was definitely not Maitreya. But, you know, he's like, I'm a physicist, it's the Buddhism that interests me. I'm a Buddhist and it's the physics that interests me. You know, that's the way it goes. He did the OT levels and his wife got cancer.
Exactly. Yeah, this is weird. People are actually getting cancer. It's like, what is going on?
The story gets a lot worse. They went to Flag and were told, well, you know, here's the address of the Hoxie Clinic or somewhere in Mexico. And when they got to the waiting room, it was full of people they knew, Scientology OTs, who probably just hadn't got the medical treatment they needed because they believed they could order.
Yeah, and this is before Miss Cabbage corrupted the OT levels. This is before Miss Cabbage did that. So this is why there was something going wrong with the OT levels. Like they weren't working before Miss Cabbage came along.
They never worked. When I was on OT5 at St. Hill, a woman called Stephanie Ryburn was doing OT5 at the same time. Now, Stephanie had been the mission holder at Moseley in Birmingham. And I got in when she was at Moseley, when she was actually away, trying to find out how it was the American mission holders were making so much money. And when she got back, she never smiled. And I really got the sense, oh, she's an OT, you know, she's reading my mind. And of course, when somebody's reading your mind, you start thinking dirty thoughts. Let's face it, you know, when you know that these people are, you know, you start, oh, stop thinking that, you know, I won't think that. And so I thought, oh, you know, she never called me by name. She never called me John. And I just thought, oh, you know, she hates me. I've got long hair. Maybe it was that. I didn't know what it was. And so that was 1975. We roll on to 1982, and I'm in the same level she is now. I'm OT5, she's OT5, and I've just come out of the waiting room at St. Hill, and she comes towards me beaming, and I realize I've never seen her smile before. And she calls me John, and she says, isn't it great that Ron's come up with something that clears up the mess that OT3 makes? And I realized she was a class 8. She'd done OT3 with Hubbard on the ship, that it had ruined her life. Another friend of mine, who'd been an executive director of a mission and was one of the sweetest, most ebullient people I'd ever met. I didn't see her for 4 years, and she'd now gone from being clear when I met her to doing OT3. And she was like a lump of stone. She was, you know, ridgy. I couldn't believe the transformation. She'd gone and done OT3, and now she was, and it finally came out. She left briefly and went back in. And while she was out, she told me that she couldn't find any body thetans, and that she'd been just completely, you know, there was something that badly wrong with her that she couldn't find any body thetans. And you're going, so because she was sane.
Yeah, basically, yeah.
So
it always makes me wonder if the person's clear, so now Hubbard has to create something to give them a new case so then he can spend time on them. But I came across an OT8. So I don't know where she could have gone weird, but she was a doctor, and in Melbourne. I'm not going to say her name because it's just rude, but I think she's a nice person, but she was obviously totally sucked into it. Yeah. And she, one time during our doctor's meeting, she farted, which was just really strange. And it was just one of those situations where it was like, that's just awkward. She also numerous times kept me waiting for ages, right? And you'd see her rock up in the car park and quickly be rushing into this, and she's supposed to be an OT. Another time she was doing something on me where she had to leave me for 20 minutes, and she left me for an hour and a half. She just forgot. classic out pointy OT, like these little weird things and stuff. And it's like, the tech does seem to mess people up. And then there's the guy who got up to OT8, and he actually says, well, we've got Marjorie Wakefield who said it stuffed her up after that. But there's a guy, he wrote a book about it, I think Lucifer's Bridge or something like that. Witek, maybe it's Witek, George Witek or something.
Yeah, who was very early on the OT8 course. He confirms what's on the material, yeah.
Yeah, and he says, he goes, his IQ dropped after doing OT8. He basically says, yeah, it stuffed up my mind, or it made me an out pointy OT or something. So anyway, it's just really deep. But with this, I'll finish off with the with the Xenu stage story. Do you actually know for sure what happened after that? They acted out the Xenu stage story.
I don't, but you know, as I say, I can only say that look, it's really simple. If Scientology worked, I wouldn't be talking to you now. If there were Scientology OTs in the 37 years that I've been talking, they would have silenced me using their OT abilities, wouldn't they?
Yeah. And
they didn't. So, and in fact, right now, there must be OTs monitoring what we're saying. You know, there must be, because, you know, and so I just suggest that if they do exist, that they strike me dead in the next 5 seconds. Oh!
You know, I had a friend who did, and this is what helped wake me up. He did OT, I don't know, 3 or OT 2 or 4 or something, or a few of them. And after doing that, he was pretty much the same. But the first week or whatever, after coming back of doing them, he was different, but he was behaving different. He was putting on that OT personality. And he'd also just started auditing people. So he was putting on this personality. And while talking to him, he was speaking slowly and he was pausing. And that made me just go, this is ridiculous. This is outrageous. He is just thinking that he's got some superior special knowledge, and he's just now putting on this personality. But it was cool to see after the first week, he dropped it and he just went back to being his normal self. And he was still, I guess, sort of acting a bit aberrated. So it just didn't do anything. And it's just possibly him sitting in a chair using his imagination the whole time. It's just excellent imaginations.
Yeah, and by now, Scientology OTs would be presidents and leaders, and, you know, the world would all be sane and safe. And it'd be great if it worked. They would have got into positions of power by now and done
exactly. The Sea Org would be like this utopia. It would be like, oh, really nice staff members and stuff. Anyway, it was great talking to you. We've been talking for ages. So I'll let you go to sleep, huh?
No, that's why, as I say, I have a delayed sleep phase. So it's early days for me. This has been great. And if you do want to talk again, if you do want to continue your show, and I'd ask you to do so, because I think the next part of the journey where, you know, are you still 50% a Scientologist, or are you now 49%?
Well, the problem is that I'm interested in doing it because I just find it interesting, but not that I'm actually expecting it or believing it. I'm just like, what is this bizarre upper level thing? I want to try it out. You know what I mean?
You do realize it could mess your head up, don't you? As you've just told me.
That's exactly the thing, because it does really seem like it messes people up. And another person who I spoke to was on the high levels. They did this outpointy thing, but they're much more of a normal person. They did this outpointy thing, and I just thought, I don't want to become one of these weird outpointy people that do these odd, weird things and stuff.
I know a group of psychology students who were never involved in Scientology, and they decided to do the whole bridge, and they did. And they graduated and off they went. And coming back to them later, what a wonderful thing to do. Oh yeah, we'll do all of that stuff, see what happens. And it's basically like, well, no, there was absolutely no benefit, and we could have done something useful instead. And so, I mean, if you want to come back and talk,
that's exactly what I'm thinking. You could end up saying it's just, well, I hit a barrier at Dianetics. I did about 9 hours of it, and I was like, look, I can only remember these things. and then you go into imagination. I just go into these crazy stories and
False
stuff,
memories.
and it's like and then they showed me a document by Hubbard saying it's okay to use your imagination, but I'm like, no, you don't understand. I really am using my imagination. I'm telling a story, then I'm going, oh crap, there's got to be engram here. Oh, a car crashed, and then I'll just say something like a car crash, and I'll be like, this is why the whole idea of the cognition being you're mocking it all up. To me, if I was in the chair doing this for hours, I would go, yeah, I get it. I'm mocking it up, you know?
Well, look, let's reconvene and we'll talk about therapy. We'll talk about, you know, what else is out there. Because I've had a long time to think about this.
Well, actually, John, I've only really tapped into a few of the questions I want to ask you. So how about, I want to give you a donation because I think it's good to, you know, compensate you for your time and also to encourage other people because, you know, you've done a lot of effort, as it takes a lot of effort to look into this sort of stuff, to speak to the people, to read the documents and that, and you should be compensated for that, basically. So then I think we should do another one, and I can get into some of these other ones, and they're more of these juicy sort of questions.
No, let's do it.
And maybe we'll make it a 3-parter. So we've done the first one, and we'll do a second and a third one, because if we do another one, I don't think we could finish these questions if it's one other one.
No, that'd be great. This has been a real pleasure. You know.
Yeah, and so you've got a Patreon, do you?
I do, but I'll get in touch with you afterwards because the Patreon's with the channel, and the channel pays my assistant, doesn't come to me. So
okay.
The work was free. Keep it so, you know. So I'll send you my personal stuff.
Yeah, and so you've got the Piece of Blue Sky book, which is a interesting history book, very interesting, and so I definitely recommend that. And where can people?
It's got to be this version, because the other one's a pirate version, which has been expurgated. This is the real thing.
What does expurgated mean?
Passages have been removed.
Why were they removed? Did someone remove the shifty, like the ones that were really out PR or something? No,
originally what happened was there was a really weird ruling in the US on J.D. Salinger, the guy who wrote Catcher in the Rye. He sued a biographer for quoting from 78 letters that were in a public collection. And he said, I could still sell them. And a judge ruled in his favor, which meant that thereafter, anything that was unpublished. So I had stuff from Hubbard's letters, his journals, and his guardian's orders. We had to take them all out and paraphrase them. The book came out. Then I went bankrupt. The publisher had gone bankrupt, and they'd illegally, criminally sold the book on without my royalties being paid. And it went bestseller. It was in the top 98 at Amazon, and I didn't get paid. Then the law changed. We spent 5 years negotiating with the publishing company that had illegally picked up the contract, and got to nowhere. So went, right, we'll put the book out with those 60 passages back in, and I added about another 40, I think. So it's got all of the actual juicy material in it. The old version, and as I say, I don't get royalties from this. And when we published the new one, they dropped their price from $33 to $12 on this copy, indicating they'd been making $21 clear profit, which was not coming to me. So this is the real one. This has got all the material in, and it's still the only actual history of Scientology. Janet Reitman basically plagiarized it, and you can see in the first 7 chapters of her book, she says, largely based upon Piece of Blue Sky and Barefaced Messiah. Well, Barefaced Messiah is also based on Piece of Blue Sky. It's in the bibliography as Hubbard Through the Looking Glass. So
where can we find this book?
It's on Amazon.
And what about it? Is it in ebook and audiobook form?
It's on Kindle. I'm actually doing an audiobook of, this is my latest book here. And I'm doing an audiobook of it. And I can promise you I won't be doing an audiobook of Piece of Blue Skies. Such hard work.
Maybe you should get some British man to do it.
Well, yeah. Having learned, you know, my L. Ron Hubbard imitation, you know, it'd be a shame to have anybody else do it. But Okay, so
Okay,
this has been
let's
great.
wrap this up.
Do you
That's all right.
book something in? Well, let's finish this off and switch it off. And I'm John Atack. This is Andy Nolch from Melbourne, and we've had a great time. And
Yes, we have.
We'll see you on the other side of the bridge.
All right. Bye-bye.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.